when it comes to the bunker, what we're going to do is we're going to give you guys literally a 4-minute crash course in the bunker. And so the first question I have for you is, what's that one big miss that you absolutely hate from the bunker? Sculling over the green, right? That's for everybody. Why does it happen?
Too fast, usually.
And so the real reason as to why it comes from is actually your posture. In that, what we talk about a lot in the putting stroke is how important this idea of hinging is. Keep the spine more neutral, get the shoulders engaged, get the weight over the ankle joint, right? What do we talk about when it comes to the full swing? If the weight gets over the ball of the foot, you come up and out of your shot because your quads are engaged. If I do that in the bunker, what do you think is going to happen? So if I get my weight over the ball of my foot, my body's going to want me to come up, and that's where we get the skull. It stops you from being able to rotate. You lift out of your shot, the hands have to get active. And so when it comes to the most important thing we could talk about from a bunker is getting into even a little bit of a deeper hinge. So by standing up straight, you guys can do this, of course. Put your hands on your thighs. We're going to go ahead and hinge the thighs a little bit deeper, then add some flex to the knees. By doing this, spine's more neutral, weight's back over the ankle joint, which is going to keep you in your posture a little bit longer. Because again, the big thing we want to do from the bunker is, of course, is hit sand first. And so what becomes very difficult is somebody says to you, depending what club I'm at, they'll say, hey, there's a golf ball. Imagine a dollar bill or 100, right? You want to enter the sand here, exit it here. You guys all heard that, right? So the reason why for most amateurs this bunker shot's very, very difficult is, of course, if you're coming up and out of your posture, right? You're trying to time the hands, to try to get the ball out, which, of course, the moment the hands fire, the leading edge digs, at which point you need a lot more bounce engagement. You have to open the face up even more, and things get even more difficult from there, because the more you open up the face, the less surface area you have to work with. And at that point, all you have to do and worry about, based on the stuff we're saying, is as long as you get into a deeper hinge in your posture, where you're forcing the club to bottom out, of course, is behind the golf ball. So you get into a deeper hinge, you can literally make a full swing from there, and there's absolutely no fear of catching any bit of golf ball. And so this is for the basic stock bunker shot. What we're going to also share with you is there's some nuances you want to observe when you're playing off of soft sand versus firm sand. The same way we talk about if you're playing in deep rough versus tight lies around the green, you want different kinds of tilt of the spine. We're going to dive into that. And so from soft sand, right, we typically want a little bit more bounce engagement. And by bounce, we mean the bottom part of the club right here, because if the leading edge digs, as we saw, the club gets stuck. It gets even worse off of soft sand. And so what we want to do is we want to engage more bounce and have a more shallow angle of attack. So instead of trying to feel that with your hands, there's actually one thing you can do with your setup that help provide that. And it's the reference point to what we call secondary tilt of the spine. So if I were to just hinge back, if you draw a line down my sternum and my navel, that's 0 degrees, right? If I were to bump my hip forward, that's called positive tilt. So positive tilt, what that does is engages more bounce without having to open up the face. Yeah. So you get a lot more consistent, in terms of not losing the face to work with. And so by you going ahead and creating this tilt, what happens to the angle of attack? It becomes more shallow, no question, which is exactly what you're looking for from a soft sand condition, particularly if it's soft and uphill. So we're going to go ahead and get you into that same hinge. We're going to bump the hip forward. What we're not saying is, we're not saying here, move the hip by itself. We're not saying, hey, drop the shoulder back. Everything is pivoting around the sternum, where the hip translates forward, the shoulder drops, which, mind you, is super beneficial in the full swing as well, particularly with driver, because that's going to preset the hip to be able to rotate a little bit more efficiently. And so if I'm off of soft sand, I want to take sand first, and I want more bounce and a more shallow angle of attack. So you can do that all via setup. I'm not saying you can't feel that with your hands, but I'd rather do things statically or dynamically, and of course, fewer moving parts, it's going to get a whole lot easier. So if I were to get here and hinge my thighs back and create a little bit more bump the hip forward, it's going to go ahead and shallow out the angle of attack and make things a whole lot easier from softer sand conditions. And of course, if I'm playing off of firm sand, I probably want to do the opposite. Because if I create too shallow angle of attack, and if I have too much bounce engaged, the club's going to go ahead and skip behind the ball, at which point it's going to hit it thin. So if we were to get into a deeper hinge, and again, this is really going to be interesting, because let's say you go up play 9 holes with your buddies, you're playing a golf course like Augusta where the sand is super soft, right? Let's say it rains all of a sudden. What happens to the sand? It gets firmer, more caked, more compact. So you might have gotten up and down every single time from the front 9 if the sand's super soft, but if you're walking to the bunker with the same exact technique, you might be shooting yourself in the foot. Because if I get here and hinge my thighs back and create what's called positive tilt that we just talked about, angle of attack gets too shallow, the club might bounce behind and skip into the golf ball, which of course might look a little bit more like that, right? And so if we want to have what's called positive tilt when the sand is soft, what kind of tilt do you think you want when the sand is firm? Negative. And so what negative tilt is, instead of bumping my hip forward, I'm going to take my hip and bump it back. What this is going to do, it's going to create a steeper angle of attack down, which of course what we're going to have to do at that point to engage some bounce is open up the face. And so you can feel that very quickly. It's not my hip going back. This is, really good for the salsa clubs down in Miami, but not so good on the golf course. So what we're looking for is the hip moves back, which will drop the shoulder down, which again is awesome from downhill bunker lies as well, as you can probably imagine, get the shoulders to match the slope. We don't want to do it by doing this, because then the bottom of the arc moves forward. You're going to catch the golf ball thin. So you can go ahead and get here. We're going to hinge back a little bit more deeply. If we open the face, we have to open the stance a touch just to accommodate the vector angle of the face. And from here, a little bit of negative tilt. So from here, everything stays the same. And we're going to go ahead and create a much steeper angle of attack without any risk of the bounce being too exposed. And so it's really interesting when it comes to understanding all the stuff people said of the past, saying, hey, you want to manipulate getting more steep, more shallow. That happens because of the secondary tilt that we're talking about. So again, you can either try to feel things with your hands over the course of your bunker shot, which is very whimsical. It's going to invite a lot of inconsistency regarding the sand contact. You're mitigating all these variables just via setup. And so what's really important to take away from this is if, again, you're out there and you only have one way to hit a bunker shot, you might be really good from soft sand, but not firm sand, or vice versa. Because another thing that I've heard a lot of is, hey, if you're in the bunker, you want to lean everything into your left side to move the ball position forward. All this is doing, I don't disagree, but all you're doing by leaning this weight forward is you're creating negative tilt to the spine. This is going to create more of a descending angle of attack, at which point they would say move the ball position forward because you're tilting forward, right? Not saying it's wrong, but you have two different variables, changing your ball position around, but also shifting forward. We're doing the same thing without moving the ball position through this negative tilt, because then the sternum is not moving, the bottom of the arc stays in the same spot. Of course, we're going to hit the sand behind the golf ball because we're hinging deeper. And so these are two very simple bunker techniques we'll have you hitting in a second. But before that, I want to talk about my favorite shot in the bunker. This is literally the stuff that really gets a tour player's amped because they've never seen the shot explained this way before. This is called Gary Player's $1 Million Secret. And the story behind it is Gary and Jack were playing a practice round together, at which point Gary walks into a bunker and sees a lie like that. He proceeds to walk in, kind of like this, and shut his face down substantially, right? Jack walks in and says, Gary, what are you doing? Gary's like, I'm going to hole out. He's like, $1 million. And so Gary's like, okay, I got nothing to lose, right? Proceeds to go ahead and close the face down like this. It's as shut as they come. He sets up with the ball off the hosel and drops his hands down. So what he hit is what's called now Gary Player's $1 Million Secret. He went ahead and hit a shot where the ball shot relatively straight. And the neat thing about this is people think when they saw the shot, what he did is he got here, and all of a sudden the club entered the sand and opened up. That's not how it worked. It's actually the force of the sand that propels the ball out. And so if you were to take a look right here, if I were to close the face, kind of like a backhoe going through the sand, see how sand gets kind of shot in towards the hosel? It took us about a full year and high-speed cameras really analyzing this to say, hey, sand gets shot in towards the hosel and then it gets shot straight up. And if the ball is sitting right there, it rides that crest of sand. Okay, I was sitting with my wife, she's a big-time surfer, and I was there like grinding my head saying, what happens? And she's like, let's take a surf trip to Biarritz. And I'm like, that's exactly it. The ball's literally riding a crest of sand that gets the ball going as high and straight as it does. And so the cute story about this is, of course, I'm sitting there at the Champions Lounge in 2014 at the Masters, and in walk Jack and Gary, and me being the wise ass I am, I sat down next to him. I started talking about this shot because Gary thought it was really interesting. Because again, he was been this bunker savant, and the only difference between science and magic is explaining the why. He didn't really understand what was happening. He just kind of figured out sitting in the bunker in South Africa just hitting a whole bunch of shots. And so he found it really neat to understand this is exactly what happened when he hit that shot, which for me was kind of cool. And then I said, me being the wise ass I am, did Jack ever pay up? He's like, F no. And so it's one of those things that's kind of a cute story, but also talks about the resolve as well as the grit that a lot of players of yesteryear had just to kind of figure stuff out. And so to be able to say this is exactly how this shot works, and to know that the harder you swing, the higher the ball is going to go, is also super interesting. Because again, I didn't make a very big swing there. The ball still shot out relatively straight. But if you were to pass me one more, and what you'll see is, if we're playing off of some, let's say it's a really, really bad lie, right? The stuff that you probably not wish, or maybe you would, your worst enemy on, right? At this point, the harder you swing, what we're looking for is kind of neat in that as the club enters the sand, see there's kind of a V that's formed right there? So there's that V and that V. The ball gets shot out at that bisecting angle. And that's where it gets forced in here and then straight up. So if you were to get here, shut the face down, drop the handle, the harder you swing, the higher it goes. And so this is a really neat shot that basically when you feel like you have got no other options, you got nothing to lose, you got this trick shot in your back pocket. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take you through a couple of these things together. But again, the biggest things to understand is we don't want to create other manipulations in the golf swing. We don't want to say, hey, it's a bunker shot, therefore a different swing. If we can make one or two slight adjustments to the setup to force us to hit the sand first, that's great. But if we can even optimize the angle of attack based upon soft versus firm sand, things get a whole bunch easier from there. And that way you have different shots in your back pocket to say, hey, different sand types warrant different setups. Language you probably not heard before, which is also my job security. Make sense?
Yeah.
Awesome.